September 12, 1942. Stalag Luft 3, 100 miles southeast of Berlin. Flight Lieutenant David Cole stood at attention while Hauptmann Werner Schmidt read the camp regulations aloud in precise, mechanical English. 23 rules. No attempted escapes without proper authorization from the Camp Escape Committee. No sabotage of German property. No disrespect toward guards. And Rule 17, the one Schmidt emphasized by reading it twice. Prisoners of war will maintain no unauthorized contact with German personnel. No trading. No personal conversations. No exchange of any items whatsoever. The regulation was absolute. Clear. Non-negotiable. Cole had been in the camp for 6 weeks. He'd memorized all 23 rules during his first day. He knew the consequences for violations. Solitary confinement. Reduced rations. In severe cases, execution. The Germans posted the regulations in English, French, Polish and Russian on every barrack wall. They wanted no confusion about expectations. What Schmidt didn't mention during his recitation was that within 72 hours, Cole would break Rule 17. So would Schmidt. So would nearly every prisoner and guard in Stalag Luft 3. So would prisoners and guards in Oflag 4C at Colditz Castle. In Stalag 383 at Hohenfels. In Oflag 64 at Schuben. In every major POW camp operated by Germany, Britain, America, and Japan. The rule existed in every prison camp handbook. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was explicit. Article 42 stated that prisoners and captors must maintain proper distance. Article 43 prohibited private economic transactions between prisoners and guards. The reasoning was sound. Fraternization created security risks. Trading enabled escape attempts. Personal relationships compromised military discipline on both sides. Every nation that signed the convention agreed. Every military that operated prison camps enforced the prohibition strictly, at least officially. Court-martials awaited guards who violated the rule. Severe punishment awaited prisoners who broke it. The stakes were high. The regulation was clear. Yet by the end of 1942, an underground economy existed in virtually every major POW camp in Europe and the Pacific. Cigarettes, chocolate, watches, photographs, letters from home, razor blades, soap, pencils, paper, clothing, medicine, alcohol, tools, maps, compasses, and information flowed constantly between prisoners and guards. The exchanges happened daily, hourly in some camps. Thousands of prisoners participated. Hundreds of guards. The trading networks grew so sophisticated that prisoners developed exchange rates. 3 cigarettes for 1 bar of soap. 5 cigarettes for a razor blade. A chocolate bar for a German newspaper. A watch for a detailed map of the surrounding countryside. Camp commanders on both sides knew it was happening. They issued periodic warnings. Conducted inspections. Imposed punishments when trades were discovered. Yet the trading continued. Had to. Both sides needed what the other possessed. The official prohibition remained in place throughout the war. Rule 17 stayed on every barrack wall. Guards continued reading it aloud during inspections. Prisoners continued acknowledging they understood. And then within hours both sides returned to trading. This is not a story about heroes or villains. It's a story about a rule that everyone agreed was necessary, that everyone promised to obey, and that nearly everyone violated. It's about why that rule existed, why it was broken, and what those violations revealed about human nature during the most destructive war in history. The first trades were small, cautious, born from practical need rather than defiance. October 1940. Oflag 9A/H at Spangenberg Castle in central Germany. Polish Lieutenant Janusz Meissner had been captured during the September 1939 invasion. After 13 months of captivity, his boots were disintegrating. The soles had separated from the uppers. Each step in the cold October rain left his socks soaked. His feet developed painful blisters that wouldn't heal in the damp conditions. Red Cross parcels occasionally included clothing, but distribution was irregular. British and French prisoners received packages more frequently than Poles. Meissner's last parcel had arrived in May, 5 months earlier. It contained no boots. Gefreiter Hans Weber noticed Meissner's deteriorating footwear during morning roll call. Weber was 34 years old, too old for frontline duty. He'd been assigned to guard duty after being wounded at Dunkirk. His left leg still ached when weather changed. He understood the misery of wet, painful feet. Weber said nothing during roll call. But 3 days later, while patrolling the exercise yard, he walked close to where Meissner was standing and spoke quietly in German. "Your boots." Meissner stiffened. He'd been taught to report any guard who initiated personal conversation. It was a test, possibly. A trap. Weber continued walking. "Tomorrow. Same time. I have boots. Size 43. You have cigarettes." Meissner had cigarettes. 2 packs from his May Red Cross parcel. He'd been saving them to trade with other prisoners for food, but his feet hurt constantly. He needed boots more than he needed extra rations. The next day, Meissner stood in the same spot during exercise period. Weber walked past, dropped a bundle wrapped in brown paper and continued without stopping. Meissner picked it up quickly and returned to his barracks. Inside the package were Wehrmacht-issue marching boots. Well-worn but serviceable. The soles were intact. The leather was weatherproofed. They would keep his feet dry through the winter. That evening, Meissner left 2 cigarette packs hidden behind a loose stone in the exercise yard wall. The next morning they were gone. Neither man spoke about the transaction. Neither acknowledged it had occurred. But Meissner wore the boots every day for the next 8 months. His feet healed. He walked without pain. Similar exchanges began appearing in other camps during late 1940 and early 1941. The pattern was consistent. Guards approached prisoners quietly. Offers were made in whispers or through hand signals. Exchanges happened quickly with minimal conversation. Both parties pretended nothing had occurred. The items traded were practical. Necessities, not luxuries. Prisoners needed clothing, boots, blankets, medicine and tools. Guards needed cigarettes, chocolate and coffee, commodities that had become scarce in Germany by 1941 as the war economy tightened. At Stalag 8B Lambsdorff in Silesia, British prisoners traded chocolate from Red Cross parcels for wool blankets. At Stalag 357 at Copernicus, American prisoners traded cigarettes for needles and thread to repair uniforms. At Stalag Luft I at Barth, RAF officers traded soap for German newspapers that provided information about the war's progress. The trades violated regulations but they served a function. Prisoners obtained items that made captivity more bearable. Guards obtained goods they couldn't purchase legally in Germany's rationed economy. Camp authorities noticed the activity. At Oflag 4C, Commandant Edgar Glesch ordered surprise inspections of prisoner barracks in January 1941. Guards found contraband, German newspapers, civilian clothing, detailed maps, compasses made from magnetized razor blades. Glesch identified the source immediately. His own guards were supplying prisoners. He called an assembly of all camp personnel and read the regulations aloud. He reminded guards that trading with prisoners was a court-martial offense. He threatened severe punishment for anyone caught violating the prohibition. For 2 weeks trading stopped. Then it resumed. Guards couldn't resist cigarettes and chocolate. Prisoners needed blankets and newspapers. The mutual need was stronger than the threat of punishment. By mid-1941, camp administrators on all sides had reached an unspoken understanding. Trading would continue. Strict enforcement was impossible. The most they could do was limit its scope and punish the most egregious violations. The rule stayed in place. Everyone acknowledged it existed. Everyone promised to obey it. And everyone continued breaking it, more brazenly with each passing month. By 1942, what had begun as isolated, cautious exchanges had evolved into organized systems. The prison camp economy became sophisticated, multilayered, and essential to daily survival. At Stalag Luft III, Royal Air Force Squadron leader Roger Bushell recognized the strategic value of trading networks. Bushell was organizing what would become the Great Escape, the March 1944 tunnel breakout that would involve 76 prisoners. He needed intelligence about German troop movements, railway schedules and security protocols. He also needed tools, civilian clothing, identification papers and accurate maps. None of these items could be obtained through legitimate channels. The only source was German guards. Bushell appointed Flight Lieutenant Tommy Guest as the camp's chief trader. Guest's role was to manage all exchanges with guards, set exchange rates, and ensure that trading supported escape operations rather than just personal comfort. Guest established rules. Only designated prisoners could approach guards. All trades had to be approved by the escape committee. Exchange rates were standardized to prevent inflation and competition. Cigarettes became the primary currency because they were universally desired, easy to conceal, and came regularly in Red Cross parcels. The standardized exchange rate at Stalag Luft III in late 1942 was 1 cigarette for 1 German newspaper, 5 cigarettes for a razor blade that could be converted into tools, 10 cigarettes for a detailed map, 20 cigarettes for a photograph of an identity document, 50 cigarettes for a complete German uniform, 100 cigarettes for a compass. Guards who wanted to trade knew to approach Guest, not individual prisoners. This centralization reduced security risks and prevented prisoners from being exploited. Gefreiter Friedrich Pfeiffer became one of Guest's most reliable suppliers. Pfeiffer had been a schoolteacher before the war. He was 41 years old, married with 3 children in Stuttgart. His family was struggling. Food rationing was severe. His wife's letters described hunger and cold. She needed extra rations to feed the children. Pfeiffer had access to cigarettes through trading with British prisoners. He could send these to his wife who could exchange them on the black market in Stuttgart for food, coal, clothing, medicine. The arrangement helped both sides. Bushell's escape committee obtained intelligence and materials. Pfeiffer helped his family survive. Neither side discussed the moral implications. Both focused on practical necessities. Similar networks developed in other camps. At Oflag 64 in Poland, American prisoners established a trading post in Barrack 7. Prisoners brought items they wanted to exchange. Guards who wanted to trade entered the barrack during their rounds and browsed available goods. Transactions happened quickly with minimal conversation. At Stalag 383 at Hohenfels, British prisoners created a pricing board that listed current exchange rates for common items. The rates fluctuated based on supply and demand, just like legitimate markets. When Red Cross parcels arrived with extra chocolate, chocolate prices dropped. When cigarette supplies dwindled, cigarette value increased. The Japanese operated prison camps differently. Regulations were stricter. Punishments for violations were more severe. Yet trading still occurred, though more covertly. At Changi Prison in Singapore, Australian prisoners traded with Korean guards, who were considered lower status than Japanese personnel. The Koreans received worse rations than Japanese soldiers and welcomed any opportunity to obtain extra food. Prisoners offered watches, rings, and fountain pens in exchange for medicine, eggs, vegetables, and information about Allied victories. The trades happened at night through barbed wire fences. Both sides risked execution if caught. At Cabanatuan in the Philippines, American prisoners traded with Filipino guards who were forced to serve the Japanese occupation. The Filipinos brought news from outside, carried messages to Filipino resistance fighters, and occasionally smuggled medicine into camp. One guard, Corporal Diego Rivera, brought antibiotics that saved multiple American lives during a typhoid outbreak in 1943. He accepted cigarettes as payment but often refused payment entirely. Rivera was executed by the Japanese in 1944 when his trading was discovered. Before his execution, he told American prisoners he had no regrets. He'd help people who needed help. That was enough. The trading networks became so established that new prisoners received orientation from experienced POWs about how the system worked. At Stalag Luft 3, newly arrived airmen were briefed by the escape committee. You'll be approached by guards who want to trade. Don't make deals on your own. Report any approaches to Tommy Guest. He'll handle negotiations. The Germans know the system. They know who to approach. Don't try to be a freelancer. You'll get yourself and others in trouble. By 1943, the prohibition against fraternization and trading had become what military theorists call a dead-letter regulation, officially enforced but universally ignored in practice. Camp commanders still read the rule aloud during inspections. Prisoners still acknowledged understanding it. Guards still signed documents affirming they would not trade. And within hours, trading resumed as if no prohibition existed. The rule was maintained not because anyone expected compliance, but because removing it would have required acknowledging that military authority had limitations, that regulations could not control every aspect of wartime behavior, that survival sometimes required breaking rules everyone agreed were necessary. The trading was not simply opportunistic criminality. It was driven by genuine, pressing needs on both sides that official channels could not address. For prisoners, the need was obvious and immediate. Camp rations were insufficient. The Geneva Convention specified minimum caloric intake for prisoners of war, 2,000 calories per day. By 1943, most German camps were providing 1,200 to 1,500 calories daily. The deficit accumulated. Prisoners lost weight continuously. Malnutrition caused weakness, disease, and deteriorating mental function. Red Cross parcels helped when they arrived. Each parcel contained tinned meat, biscuits, chocolate, powdered milk, cheese, jam, and cigarettes. But distribution was irregular. Some prisoners received parcels weekly. Others went months without packages. Trading with guards allowed prisoners to obtain food, medicine, and clothing that would otherwise be unavailable. The transactions literally kept people alive. At Stalag 9C at Bad Salza, American prisoner Private Robert Morrison had developed a severe vitamin C deficiency by January 1944. His gums bled constantly. His teeth loosened. He was developing scurvy. The camp doctor had no vitamin C supplements. Red Cross parcels occasionally included canned fruit, but Morrison hadn't received a parcel in 6 weeks. Guard Unteroffizier Ernst Becker noticed Morrison's deteriorating condition. Becker had been a grocer before the war. He recognized scurvy symptoms. He knew Morrison would die if the condition wasn't treated. Becker brought 2 jars of sauerkraut from his personal rations. Sauerkraut contained vitamin C. Morrison ate it over several days. Within 2 weeks, the bleeding stopped. His gums healed. His teeth stabilized. Morrison offered Becker his entire month's cigarette ration as payment. Becker accepted 2 packs and refused the rest. "You need food more than I need cigarettes," he said in broken English. "Stay alive. The war will end eventually." Becker's motivations were mixed. Humanitarian concern was real. He didn't want to watch a young man die from something preventable. But Becker also understood that keeping prisoners healthy reduced problems for guards. Sick prisoners required medical attention that strained limited resources. Dead prisoners created administrative complications and raised questions from camp commanders about guard competence. Self-interest and compassion were not mutually exclusive. Both motivated the trading. For guards, the needs were different but equally pressing. By 1943, Germany's wartime economy was collapsing. Consumer goods had disappeared from civilian markets. Ration cards provided minimal food. Heating fuel was scarce. Clothing was nearly impossible to obtain. Guards with families in cities faced desperate situations. Their wives wrote letters describing hunger, cold, and fear. Their children needed medicine, shoes, warm clothes. Their elderly parents needed extra nutrition to survive harsh winters. Red Cross parcels sent to Allied prisoners contained items that had become luxury goods in Germany. Chocolate was unavailable to German civilians. Coffee had been replaced by ersatz substitutes made from roasted grain. Cigarettes were strictly rationed and of poor quality. Guards who obtained these items through trading could send them home. Wives could exchange chocolate and coffee on the black market for potatoes, firewood, medicine, and other necessities. The trading network became a survival mechanism for guard families as much as for prisoners. Feldwebel Karl Schneider had 3 children in Hamburg. His youngest daughter, Greta, was 6 years old and chronically ill. She needed extra milk and eggs to maintain her strength. Hamburg's rationing system couldn't provide sufficient nutrition for sick children. Schneider traded with British prisoners at Stalag 357. He obtained chocolate and cigarettes. He sent them to his wife in Hamburg. She traded them at the local black market for fresh eggs and milk. Greta's health improved. Schneider understood he was violating regulations. He understood the consequences if caught. But he made a calculation. His daughter's health mattered more than his military career. He continued trading throughout 1943 and 1944. The Japanese guards who traded at Changi and Cabanatuan faced different pressures. Many were Korean conscripts who received even worse treatment than Allied prisoners. They were beaten regularly by Japanese officers. They received insufficient rations. They were forbidden from possessing items that prisoners could obtain through Red Cross parcels. Korean guard Park Chung-hee traded with Australian prisoners at Changi throughout 1943. He brought vegetables and occasionally meat smuggled from outside the camp. Prisoners gave him cigarettes, chocolate, and vitamin tablets from medical supplies. Park was caught in September 1943. Japanese officers beat him unconscious. He was transferred to a labor battalion and sent to Burma, where he died during the construction of the Burma Railway in March 1944. The Australian prisoners who had traded with Park held a memorial service when they learned of his death. They recognized that Park had risked everything to help them, not because he was required to, but because he chose to. The trading relationship had created a human connection that transcended the prisoner-guard dynamic. By 1944, trading had become so normalized that prisoners and guards discussed it openly within their respective communities. At Stalag Luft 3, prisoners debated the ethics during evening discussions in barracks. Some argued that trading with the enemy was a form of collaboration. Others countered that survival required pragmatism. Trading obtained necessities that couldn't be acquired otherwise. Refusing to trade on moral grounds meant accepting unnecessary suffering and potential death. The debate never reached consensus. Prisoners continued trading. Those who objected on principle simply didn't participate but didn't condemn those who did. Guards had similar conversations. Some believed trading was dishonorable, a betrayal of military discipline. Others viewed it as necessary adaptation to wartime realities. Their families needed support. The official system couldn't provide it. Trading filled the gap. Both sides ultimately reached the same conclusion. The rule against fraternization and trading was impractical. Human needs were more powerful than regulations. The prohibition would remain officially in force, but practical reality would continue to diverge from official policy. This divergence created a peculiar situation where everyone acknowledged a rule existed, everyone agreed it was important, and everyone systematically violated it while maintaining the pretense of compliance. The trading relationships were supposed to remain transactional. Pure business. No personal connection. Both sides understood the importance of maintaining emotional distance. Yet repeated interactions created familiarity. Familiarity created understanding. Understanding sometimes created friendship. At Stalag Luft 3, Flight Lieutenant David Cole had been trading with Gefreiter Anton Weber for 8 months by June 1943. Their exchanges were routine. Cole provided cigarettes. Weber brought German newspapers that Cole's escape committee used to track the war's progress. The transactions happened the same way each time. Weber walked past a specific section of fence during morning exercise. Cole stood nearby. Weber dropped a newspaper. Cole retrieved it and left cigarettes in the same location. Neither man spoke. Neither acknowledged the other's presence. On June 18, Weber approached the fence but didn't drop a newspaper. He stood there staring at the ground. Cole noticed Weber's expression. He'd seen that look before. Grief. Cole walked closer to the fence. What happened? Weber looked up. His eyes were red. My son. Killed in Tunisia. The letter came yesterday. Weber's son, Friedrich, had been 19 years old. Panzer Regiment, Afrika Korps. Killed during the Allied offensive after the German surrender at Tunisia in May. The official notification provided minimal details. Died in combat. Buried with military honors. Cole said nothing for a moment. What could he say? His own bombs had probably killed German soldiers. Maybe he'd killed Friedrich Weber. The thought was unbearable. I'm sorry, Cole said finally. The words felt inadequate. Weber nodded. He wanted to be a teacher. Like me. Before the war. He paused. The newspaper. I forgot it today. It doesn't matter. Weber reached into his coat and pulled out a small photograph. He showed it to Cole through the fence. A young man in Wehrmacht uniform, smiling, confident, full of life that no longer existed. Friedrich, Weber said. My only son. Cole looked at the photograph. He thought about his own brother serving with the Royal Navy somewhere in the Atlantic. He thought about his friends who'd been killed. He thought about all the young men dying on all sides while old men made decisions in distant capitals. The war needs to end, Cole said. Yes, Weber agreed. But it won't. Not yet. Weber put the photograph away. He walked back toward the guard tower. Cole returned to his barracks. Neither man reported the conversation. Neither mentioned it again. But the next week, Weber brought 2 newspapers instead of 1. Cole left extra cigarettes. The trading continued, but something had shifted. They weren't just exchanger and supplier anymore. They were 2 men trapped in roles they hadn't chosen, trying to survive circumstances beyond their control. Similar transformations occurred in other camps. Professional transactions evolved into personal relationships despite regulations prohibiting such connections. At Oflag 64, American Lieutenant Charles Ross developed an unlikely friendship with German Guard Oberstfreiter Heinrich Vogel. Their initial interactions were purely transactional. Ross traded cigarettes for maps. Vogel needed cigarettes to send to his wife in Dresden. But over months of trading, conversations developed. Vogel spoke some English. Ross spoke minimal German. They managed to communicate. Vogel described life in Dresden before the war. The architecture, the music, the culture. He'd been a musician, played violin in a small orchestra. The war had interrupted everything. His orchestra had disbanded when members were conscripted. Ross talked about Montana where he'd grown up. The mountains, the vast open spaces, the cattle ranch his family operated. He described American football, jazz music, and the 1939 World's Fair in New York. Neither man discussed military matters. They avoided politics. They talked about normal life, the existence that had been suspended when war began. In August 1944, Vogel received notification that Dresden had been bombed by Allied aircraft. His house was destroyed. His wife and daughter had survived by hiding in the basement, but they'd lost everything. Vogel came to the fence that day visibly shaken. Ross saw him and approached. My family, Vogel said. The bombing. Everything is gone. Ross knew the bombing had happened. He'd heard about it through camp intelligence networks. Allied prisoners had celebrated the attack as a strategic victory. He hadn't thought about the people in Dresden who weren't soldiers, who weren't making decisions, who were just trying to survive. I'm sorry, Ross said. He meant it. Vogel nodded slowly. I know you didn't do it. I know you're just a soldier like me. War, Ross said. Yes, war. They stood in silence. Then Vogel pulled out a pack of cigarettes, his own rations, and offered one to Ross through the fence. Ross hesitated. Taking cigarettes from a guard violated regulations. But refusing felt wrong. He accepted the cigarette. Vogel lit it for him. They smoked together in silence. The relationship between Ross and Vogel violated every military regulation about prisoner-guard interaction. They weren't supposed to have personal conversations. They weren't supposed to develop empathy for each other. They weren't supposed to share cigarettes like friends. Yet they did. And similar violations were occurring in dozens of camps across Europe. At Stalag 8B, British prisoner George Brough and German guard Ludwig Hartmann played chess through the fence twice a week for 6 months. They'd started trading in early 1943. Brough had mentioned he missed playing chess. Hartmann had been a chess player before the war. He made a board and pieces from wood scraps. They played through the fence, moving pieces by calling out positions. They never discussed why this was acceptable while trading was supposedly forbidden. They just played chess and talked about the game, about strategy, about famous matches they'd studied before the war. Neither man was delusional. They understood they were enemies by definition. If Brough escaped, Hartmann would be required to shoot him. If Hartmann's position was overrun by Allied forces, Brough might be required to take him prisoner. But during those chess games the war paused. They were just 2 men who enjoyed a complex game and found comfort in that simple connection. These relationships created moral complexity that regulations couldn't address. The rule against fraternization assumed that prisoners and guards were fundamentally different, that military roles created absolute divisions that couldn't be crossed. But the men who traded, who talked, who shared cigarettes and played chess discovered they weren't that different. They were fathers worried about children. Sons missing parents. Husbands separated from wives. Men who wanted the war to end so they could return to interrupted lives. The trading started as practical necessity. For some, it remained purely transactional. But for others, repeated interactions revealed common humanity that regulations insisted didn't exist. This realization was dangerous. It undermined the psychological mechanisms that made war possible. If enemy guards were human, if prisoners were human, if everyone was just trying to survive, then what was the war for? Who benefited from all this death and suffering? These questions had no answers. The men in the camps didn't expect answers. They just continued trading, talking, surviving, and occasionally allowing themselves to see the human being on the other side of the fence. The trading networks existed openly enough that camp authorities couldn't claim ignorance. Periodic crackdowns attempted to reassert control, to remind everyone that rules still mattered, that violations had consequences. November 1943. Stalag Luft 3. Commandant Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindner ordered a comprehensive inspection of all prisoner barracks and a full audit of guard activities. Von Lindner had received complaints from Berlin about lax security at the camp. He needed to demonstrate proper oversight. The inspections revealed extensive contraband. Guards found German newspapers, civilian clothing, detailed maps of the surrounding area, compasses, identification documents, and tools that could be used for tunneling. The evidence clearly indicated that guards were supplying prisoners with prohibited materials. Von Lindner assembled all camp guards and delivered a harsh warning. Anyone caught trading would face court-martial and possible execution. He wasn't exaggerating. In September 1943, a guard at Oflag 6B had been executed for trading with prisoners. The punishment was meant to discourage violations. Von Lindner's warning had immediate effect. Trading at Stalag Luft 3 stopped completely for 3 weeks. Prisoners who had come to depend on extra food and supplies suffered. Weight loss accelerated. Morale dropped. But the underlying needs hadn't changed. Prisoners still needed items that official channels couldn't provide. Guards still needed cigarettes and chocolate for their families. The economic pressure was too strong to resist indefinitely. By December 1943, trading had resumed, though more cautiously. Exchanges moved to less visible locations. Conversations became briefer. Both sides took greater care to avoid detection. The crackdown achieved its purpose from the administration's perspective. It demonstrated that rules were still being enforced. But it didn't stop the violations. It just made them less obvious. Similar patterns appeared in other camps. At Stalag 383, camp authorities conducted a surprise inspection in January 1944. They found a sophisticated pricing board in Barak 12 that listed exchange rates for various goods. The discovery led to punishment for several prisoners. 2 weeks solitary confinement for the men who operated the exchange. The punishments were severe enough to discourage open trading posts but not severe enough to stop individual transactions. Prisoners learned to be more discreet. The trading continued without centralized organization. Japanese camps administered harsher consequences. At Changi Prison, guards caught trading faced execution, not merely imprisonment. The threat was credible. Multiple guards were executed between 1942 and 1945 for fraternizing with prisoners. Yet even the death penalty didn't stop all trading. The need was too great. Korean guard Kim Sung-jae continued bringing vegetables to Australian prisoners despite knowing the consequences. He was caught in March 1944. The Japanese executed Kim publicly in front of all prisoners and guards. They wanted the execution to serve as a deterrent, to demonstrate what happened to those who violated regulations. The execution had the opposite effect among some prisoners. They held Kim in higher regard after his death, recognizing that he'd risked everything to help them. Several Australian prisoners later testified that Kim's kindness had restored their faith in human decency during the darkest period of their captivity. The moral complexity was inescapable. Kim had violated regulations. He'd broken rules that existed for legitimate security reasons. Yet his violations had saved lives and demonstrated compassion that official policies prohibited. After the war, some of the Australian prisoners who had known Kim sought out his family in Korea. They wanted to tell Kim's widow and children that their husband and father had been a good man who'd helped others at great personal cost. The consequences for prisoners caught trading varied by camp and circumstance. At some camps, punishment was relatively mild. Reduced rations, extra work details, brief solitary confinement. At other camps, particularly those operated by the Japanese, punishment could be fatal. At Cabanatuan in the Philippines, American prisoner Sergeant James Davis was caught trading with a Filipino guard in June 1943. The Japanese commander ordered Davis beaten in front of all prisoners. The beating lasted 20 minutes. Davis survived but never fully recovered from his injuries. The brutality was intended to discourage further trading. It didn't work. Prisoners continued trading because the alternative, slow starvation and death from malnutrition, was worse than the risk of punishment. The guards who were caught faced courts-martial that could result in execution, imprisonment or transfer to frontline combat units. At Stalag XVIB in Austria, Guard Corporal Joseph Bauer was court-martialed in February 1944 for trading with American prisoners. The evidence was clear. Bauer had provided maps and railway schedules in exchange for cigarettes and chocolate. The military court found him guilty of endangering camp security and sentenced him to 6 months imprisonment followed by transfer to the Eastern Front. Bauer's wife wrote to camp authorities pleading for leniency. She explained that her husband had traded to obtain items for their children, that he'd meant no harm, that he was a good man who'd made a mistake. The appeals were denied. Bauer served his imprisonment and was sent to the Eastern Front in September 1944. He was killed during the Soviet offensive in Poland 2 months later. His death illustrated the ultimate price some guards paid for violating regulations, yet it didn't stop other guards from continuing to trade. The needs remained. The economic pressure continued. The violations persisted. By late 1944, camp authorities on all sides had largely abandoned aggressive enforcement of anti-fraternization rules. They understood that stopping all trading was impossible. Resources needed for enforcement could be better used elsewhere. As long as trading didn't directly facilitate escapes or sabotage, administrators increasingly chose to ignore it. This acceptance was never official. No commander publicly acknowledged that trading would be tolerated. The rules remained in force. Periodic inspections continued. Occasional punishments were still administered. But the underlying understanding had changed. Everyone recognized that the prohibition was unenforceable in practice. The rule existed as an official standard that was systematically violated by nearly everyone involved. This created a peculiar moral situation where following the rules meant accepting unnecessary suffering while breaking them often served humanitarian purposes. The traditional framework of obedience and discipline couldn't adequately address this complexity. The most disturbing realization was that rule-breaking sometimes served more humanitarian purposes than rule following. March 1944. Stalag 9B at Bad Orb in central Germany. American prisoner Private William Shapiro had developed pneumonia. The camp hospital had minimal medical supplies. No antibiotics. No modern treatment. The standard protocol was to isolate the patient, provide extra blankets and wait. Most pneumonia patients in the camp died. The combination of malnutrition, cold, and inadequate medical care was lethal. Camp Dr. Captain Michael Goldman estimated Shapiro had perhaps a 20% chance of survival. Guard Unteroffizier Franz Muller had been trading with American prisoners for several months. He developed a reputation as reliable and fair. When word spread about Shapiro's condition, several prisoners approached Muller with a proposal. They had accumulated substantial cigarette reserves, nearly 500 cigarettes saved from Red Cross parcels. They offered all 500 to Muller in exchange for sulfa drugs, the antibiotics that could save Shapiro's life. Muller faced a decision. The trading would be his most serious violation yet. Previous exchanges had involved newspapers, small amounts of food, minor contraband. Bringing antibiotics into camp required accessing military medical supplies, a theft that could result in execution if discovered. Muller also knew that sulfa drugs were scarce in Germany by 1944. Civilians couldn't obtain them. German soldiers received them, but supplies were limited. Taking antibiotics to give to an American prisoner meant those drugs wouldn't be available for German soldiers who might need them. The moral calculation was complex. Muller could follow regulations, refuse the trade, and let Shapiro die. This would be the legally correct decision. Or he could violate regulations, obtain the drugs, and probably save Shapiro's life. Muller took 3 days to decide. He consulted no one. The decision was his alone. On March 18, he brought a package to the camp hidden in his coat. Inside were sulfa tablets, enough for a full treatment course. He gave them to the prisoners who'd made the offer. They gave him the 500 cigarettes. Captain Goldman administered the sulfa drugs to Shapiro following standard protocols. The fever broke after 4 days. Shapiro recovered completely. He survived the war and returned to the United States in June 1945. Muller's violation of regulations saved a life. Following the rules would have resulted in death. The paradox was inescapable. Similar situations occurred throughout the camp system. At Stalag Luft II, British prisoner squadron leader Thomas Bennett developed severe dysentery in August 1944. The camp had no effective treatment. Bennett was losing weight rapidly, approaching the point where survival became impossible. Guard Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann traded with Bennett's Barak mates. They offered him 200 cigarettes for kaolin powder, a medication that could stop the dysentery. Hoffmann obtained the powder and delivered it. Bennett recovered. After the war, Bennett sought out Hoffmann. He found him in 1947 living in Hamburg. Bennett thanked him for saving his life. Hoffmann was embarrassed by the recognition. He said he'd only done what seemed right at the time. Bennett offered to help Hoffmann emigrate to Britain if he wanted to leave Germany. Hoffmann declined but appreciated the offer. They corresponded occasionally for several years. The trading relationship had created a connection that outlasted the war. These instances of life-saving violations raised questions about the moral validity of the original prohibition. If breaking the rule saved lives while following it caused unnecessary death, could the rule be considered morally sound? Military discipline required bright-line rules. Fraternization was prohibited because it created security risks and potentially facilitated escapes. The prohibition made sense in theory. But reality was messier. Not all fraternization led to security breaches. Some trading relationships resulted in genuine humanitarian outcomes. Some guards who violated regulations did so for compassionate reasons, not merely for profit. The camps couldn't function on a case-by-case evaluation of whether each violation was justified. Rules needed to be clear and universally applicable. But the universal application of the anti-fraternization rule sometimes produced clearly unjust outcomes. At Oflag 64, American prisoner Lieutenant Robert Barr developed acute appendicitis in December 1944. The camp hospital could perform the surgery, but they lacked proper anesthesia. Operating without anesthesia was dangerous and created risk of shock that could kill the patient. Guard Oberstfreiter Klaus Weber obtained morphine through trading networks. He brought it to the camp hospital. The surgery proceeded with proper pain management. Barr survived. Weber violated regulations. He faced court-martial if caught. Yet his violation prevented unnecessary suffering and probably saved a life. The official rule insisted this was wrong. Common moral intuition suggested it was right. These paradoxes multiplied throughout the camp system. Guards who strictly followed regulations sometimes watched prisoners die from preventable causes. Guards who violated regulations sometimes saved lives and reduced suffering. The prohibition against fraternization was meant to maintain order and security. But in practice, some fraternization served humanitarian purposes that official policies couldn't address. After the war, military analysts studied the trading networks. They tried to determine whether the rule against fraternization should be modified. The analysis was inconclusive. Trading had created security risks. Some maps and tools obtained through trading had facilitated escape attempts. Information provided by guards had helped prisoners plan tunnels and coordinate breakouts. From a pure security perspective, the prohibition was justified. But trading had also saved lives, reduced suffering, and maintained morale. Prisoners who could trade for extra food and medicine survived at higher rates than those who couldn't. Guards who traded often developed more humane attitudes toward prisoners, treating them with greater dignity than strict military protocol required. The rule against fraternization was both necessary and insufficient. It was too rigid to accommodate legitimate humanitarian needs, yet too important to abandon entirely. This paradox reflected a broader truth about wartime regulations. Rules created to maintain order sometimes had to be broken to serve justice. Strict adherence to protocol sometimes caused greater harm than selective violations. The men in the camps understood this intuitively. They broke rules when breaking them served clear humanitarian purposes. They followed rules when compliance maintained necessary order. They navigated the gray area between absolute obedience and complete lawlessness. No official policy could capture this nuance. The regulations remained binary, obey or disobey. Reality was far more complex. The war ended in May 1945 in Europe, September 1945 in the Pacific. Millions of prisoners returned home. Thousands of guards faced prosecution for war crimes. The camps were liberated, then dismantled, then forgotten. But the memory of what happened in those camps, particularly the systematic violation of the anti-fraternization rule, lingered. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors charged numerous camp commanders with crimes against humanity. The charges focused on torture, starvation, and systematic murder of prisoners. The trading networks were largely ignored in the proceedings. Some defendants actually cited the trading as evidence of their humane treatment of prisoners. They argued that allowing trade demonstrated they treated POWs well. Prosecutors dismissed these arguments. The existence of trading didn't excuse war crimes. But in trials of lower-ranking guards, the trading issue became more significant. Some guards who were prosecuted for their role in camp operations presented evidence that they'd helped prisoners through trading. Character witnesses, including former prisoners, testified that certain guards had shown compassion and violated regulations to provide assistance. At the trial of guard Karl Schneider, who traded at Stalag 357, 3 British prisoners testified on his behalf. They described how Schneider had obtained medicine for sick prisoners, how he'd warned them about impending inspections, how he'd treated them with dignity despite being their captor. The tribunal reduced Schneider's sentence based on this testimony. Instead of imprisonment, he received probation. The court acknowledged that his violations of military regulations had served humanitarian purposes and demonstrated moral courage. Similar cases occurred throughout the post-war justice system. Guards who could demonstrate they'd helped prisoners often received lighter sentences than those who'd followed regulations strictly. This created an unusual situation where violation of military rules became evidence of moral character while strict adherence to regulations suggested complicity in the camp system's cruelty. The paradox wasn't lost on military planners developing guidelines for future conflicts. The Geneva Conventions were updated in 1949. The new version maintained the prohibition against fraternization but added provisions acknowledging that benevolent interactions between captors and prisoners should not be punished if they served humanitarian purposes. The updated language tried to distinguish between trading that facilitated escapes, still prohibited, and trading that merely helped prisoners survive, potentially acceptable. But creating clear guidelines proved difficult. How could regulations distinguish between a guard who traded maps to help an escape attempt and a guard who traded medicine to save a life? Both violated the anti-fraternization rule. Both involved similar transactions. Yet the moral implications were entirely different. The 1949 Geneva Conventions never fully resolved this tension. The prohibition remained but with enough flexibility that commanders could choose to overlook minor violations serving clear humanitarian purposes. Veterans from both sides rarely spoke about the trading networks after returning home. The topic was complicated. Admitting you'd traded with the enemy felt like confessing collaboration. Yet most participants knew they'd done nothing wrong. In 1972, a reunion of former Stalag Luft 3 prisoners was held in London. Over 200 former POWs attended. During evening discussions, the topic of trading emerged. Squadron leader Roger Bushell had been killed after the Great Escape in March 1944, but others who'd managed the camp's trading network were present. They described how the system had worked, how it had obtained tools and intelligence that made the escape possible. Several attendees expressed discomfort with celebrating rule violations. Others argued that survival in extreme circumstances required flexibility. The debate continued for hours without resolution. Near the end of the discussion, Wing Commander Harry Day stood to speak. Day had been senior British officer at Stalag Luft 3 and had authorized the trading network despite its violation of regulations. "We broke rules," Day said. "We violated regulations we'd sworn to uphold. But we did it to survive, to help our fellow prisoners survive, and occasionally to show basic human decency to guards who were as trapped as we were." He paused. "I don't apologize for that. The rules existed for good reasons. But following them blindly would have meant unnecessary death and suffering. We chose life over protocol. I'd make the same choice again." The room remained silent for several moments. Then someone began clapping. Others joined. Within seconds the entire room was applauding. The applause wasn't celebrating rule-breaking in general. It was acknowledging that extreme circumstances sometimes require violating normal standards, that survival and human decency sometimes conflict with regulations, that moral judgment is more complex than simple obedience or disobedience. German guards who traded rarely attended public reunions. The stigma of having been prison camp guards made public acknowledgement difficult. But some maintained private correspondence with former prisoners they'd helped. Gefreiter Anton Weber, who'd lost his son in Tunisia and later traded with David Cole at Stalag Luft 3, received a letter from Cole in 1953. Cole wrote, "I've thought often about our conversations at the fence. You showed me that even in war human connection is possible. You helped me survive with your newspapers. More importantly, you helped me remember that Germans were people, not just the enemy. That realization has shaped how I've lived since the war ended." Weber kept the letter until his death in 1978. His family found it among his possessions. They donated it to a German museum dedicated to preserving POW camp history. The trading networks that violated regulations so systematically during World War II left no official records. Military documents acknowledged that trading occurred but rarely documented specific transactions or participants. Most knowledge about the networks comes from personal memoirs and oral histories collected decades after the war. These stories reveal a truth about human behavior under extreme pressure. Formal rules matter less than immediate needs, official prohibitions can't always control what people actually do, and survival sometimes requires breaking regulations everyone agrees are important. The rule against fraternization and trading was necessary. It protected security. It maintained military discipline. It prevented the kinds of personal relationships that could compromise both sides' ability to fight. But it was also insufficient. It couldn't account for individual acts of compassion. It couldn't recognize that some violations served more moral purposes than strict compliance. It couldn't acknowledge that humanity sometimes matters more than regulations. The prisoners and guards who traded understood they were breaking rules. Most felt some guilt about the violations. Yet most also believed the trading was necessary and in many cases, morally justified despite being legally prohibited. This tension between legal obligation and moral intuition never fully resolved. It couldn't resolve. Military discipline requires clear rules and consistent enforcement. But human circumstances are rarely simple enough for rules to capture every legitimate moral consideration. The prison camp trading networks of World War II demonstrate this complexity. They show that sometimes the right thing to do is also the prohibited thing to do, that survival can require disobedience, that compassion sometimes means violating regulations designed to prevent compassion. April 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Camps were being liberated. David Cole walked out of Stalag Luft 3 as Allied forces approached. He never saw Anton Weber again. 50 years later, in 1995, Cole was interviewed for a documentary about POW experiences. The interviewer asked about the trading networks. Cole described his exchanges with Weber. He mentioned Weber's son, killed in Tunisia. He talked about the newspapers and cigarettes, the whispered conversations at the fence, the brief moment when war paused and two men simply talked as human beings. Did you feel guilty about trading with the enemy? The interviewer asked. Cole considered the question. Guilty? No. Conflicted? Yes. I was breaking regulations I'd sworn to obey. But I was also trying to survive. And sometimes, in those conversations, I was remembering that the men guarding us were human beings with families and losses and fears, just like us. He paused. The rule said we couldn't fraternize. The rule said we couldn't trade. The rule was probably necessary for military discipline. But it was also impossible to follow completely if you wanted to survive and maintain your humanity. So everyone broke it? Everyone, Cole confirmed. Guards and prisoners. Germans, British, Americans, French, Polish. Everyone broke the rule because the rule couldn't account for what it actually meant to be human in those circumstances. The interviewer ended with one more question. If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you follow the rule or break it again? Cole smiled slightly. I'd break it again. Without hesitation. Some rules are meant to be broken when following them causes more harm than violating them. That's not lawlessness. It's recognizing that rules are tools for achieving justice and order, not substitutes for moral judgment. The prison camp rule everyone secretly broke was never officially changed. It remained in military regulations throughout the war. It appears in modern POW guidelines with minor modifications. The prohibition against fraternization still exists. But everyone who lived through the camp system, who traded for survival, who formed brief human connections across enemy lines, who chose compassion over compliance, understands a truth that regulations can't capture. Sometimes breaking the rule is the only way to remain fully human. That understanding doesn't make the violations legal. It doesn't eliminate the security concerns that justified the prohibition. It doesn't resolve the tension between discipline and compassion. But it does reveal something essential about human nature. When faced with extreme circumstances, people find ways to survive that official policies can't predict or control. They form connections that regulations forbid. They trade, they talk, they occasionally recognize their common humanity despite being classified as enemies. The rule existed for good reasons. The violations occurred for better ones. Both truths can coexist, uncomfortable and unresolved, just like they did in every prison camp throughout World War II. That's the legacy. Not heroes or villains. Not right or wrong. Just human beings navigating impossible circumstances, breaking necessary rules for necessary reasons, and discovering that survival sometimes requires disobedience while dignity sometimes requires connection with those officially designated as the enemy. The rule everyone broke taught this lesson. Regulations matter, but people matter more. Security is important, but humanity is essential. And sometimes, the most moral thing you can do is the thing that's explicitly prohibited. Every prisoner and guard who traded understood this intuitively. They lived it daily. They never resolved the contradiction. They just survived it, one forbidden transaction at a time, until the war finally ended and they could return to a world where such impossible choices were no longer required. The fence still separated them. The rules still prohibited contact. But in the space between regulation and reality, human connection found a way to exist despite every official attempt to prevent it. That connection, fragile and forbidden and morally complicated, was perhaps the most honest thing that happened in the camps. It was life refusing to be reduced to regulations. It was humanity persisting despite systems designed to eliminate it. And it was the rule everyone broke, the prohibition everyone violated, the line everyone crossed because staying on the proper side meant denying something essential about what it meant to be human, even in the middle of the most destructive war in history.